close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
It's episode 46. 46 times it's been quarantine and we've come together. And as you all know, if you've been following us, we all started in the early days of the pandemic because we thought what innovation was going on under the surface as people came together and co-created and started thinking through how does life change when we all have to connect, but we're physically disconnected. And, you know, we've taken a look at deep things like synthetic biology. We've taken a look at how cities are changing. We often come back to this theme of how the media is changing. And in a way, the arc of this show is now moving on to how do we build this world that's next in this very fluid moment when clearly there's a lot of work to be done in our cities, in our economy, in the environment. And Mickey and I are excited today because we're going to dig into really some of the most powerful intelligences and tools we're building on Earth, which is this amazing interface between the world of gaming and the world of simulation and artificial intelligence, two sides of the same thing, but in a way coming at each other from different worlds, from the enterprise world, from the entertainment world. And today we're going to get into that with three remarkable guests. And by the way, when we talk about gaming, unless you're addicted to gaming, you may not realize that at $150 billion in the economy, it dwarfs music at $20 billion and the movie industry at $45 billion. And what a gaming platform increasingly is a very rich intelligence with agent-based modeling and machine learning. And those same technologies are being used to help design and model our cities. They're used for autonomous vehicles to run thousands of simulations of how one drives around. And so today we're going to look at both sides of that. And joining me, our co-host, Mickey. Hey, Mick.
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Howdy. Well, this is a very exciting show. We have the chief head of artificial intelligence for Unity, which is one of the major gaming platforms, just went public, got an $80 billion valuation. We have
and Unity is fascinating. When I was a fellow at Autodesk, we announced a really big deal partnership between Autodesk and Unity because we recognize that Unity is where all the people are that are authoring games. And you know, Autodesk makes amazing objects and things, you know, buildings and places, but Unity has just been a phenomenal story of creating powerful tools for you to create virtual worlds. And so I'm super excited to hang out a little bit with Danny and hear what's happening as they've started to get a little smarter and add AI. And then why don't we bring on the guests, actually? I think it might be kind of fun.
Let's bring on our guests and say hello. So from Unity, Danny Lange. Hey, Danny.
Hey.
And then joining us next is going to be our friend Kristen Berman, who comes from the world of behavioral economics and the Irrational Lab. Hey, Kristen.
Kristen's on mute, but
we have to unmute.
Yeah, you'll have to unmute. There you go. Kristen, how you doing?
Hi guys, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Classic fail.
Yeah, it's part of life. It's the quarantine. And then we also have Kate Compton. I met Kate years ago, but I was kind of a big fan before that. And we ended up getting together at a summit to think about the future of learning and how machines and humans might play together to create new things. And I've just followed her for a while, and I'm a big fan. Kate, thank you for coming on the show as well.
Thanks for bringing me on.
And this is going to be remarkable. We're going to get into this whole connection between simulation gaming and AI with Danny. And of course, Kristen, in many ways, in behavioral economics, you guys manufacture behavior. You come up with the economic rules of how we get behavior change, which when we hook them up with the very powerful systems we're building, right, can bring about big change. And then Kate, what a wonderful background in creating some of the most fun things we've played, from sport to casual making. and we could just spend 2 hours
working
with
on
Kate.
SimCity and
Yep.
yeah. But actually, I love her procedural grammar tracery and casual bot maker as well. So just
Yeah.
it's how do you actually give people access to start just playing with little bits of proceduralism? I don't know if proceduralism's a word. Kate, at one of your presentations, I remember you showing where you rolled die in the 1700s or 1800s, and it would actually reassemble Beethoven or Mozart music or something.
Yeah, the music. I don't speak German, but dice music.
Mhm.
Yep, to make bootleg Mozart songs.
Perfect. So we'll get into bootlegging a little later. But thanks for joining us, all of you. And I think we're going to start with Danny and just get a sense of what's happening in the game platform environment. What's happening at Unity? Give us maybe a little bit of your background first, where you came from, and then what happened when you got to Unity.
Yeah. So I've been in enterprise most of my life. I ran the corporate-wide machine learning platform at Amazon, and I did the same at Uber, where I was head of machine learning and AI. When it came to Unity, there was a reason for that. And if you take a bigger perspective in the world of AI, it sort of started out maybe about 70 years ago with the first computer chess program. And for many years, AI was characterized by really smart people doing really smart things with computers. But what we have seen over the last 10, 15 years, and it had accelerated over the maybe last 5 years, is this increasing use of data to train these systems instead. So data becomes key. And at companies like Amazon and Uber, we had lots of great data, but we also figured out that more is better, and we also found out that some of the data is problematic. It's biased. There's privacy issues. So the real reason I came to Unity was I saw the game engine as a fantastic vehicle for generating the real, truly massive amounts of data that's needed to progress the field of AI.
I think you got to explain that a little bit more to me. So if I'm Uber, I could drive a bunch of cars with lots of cameras. I guess it was the commoditization of sensors in some ways that led to us finally, whether it's the super sensor pack called a phone for Amazon, or the car itself could have LiDAR and everything else. So it was the ability to capture that. That seems like they generate a heck of a lot of information. How could you generate more information in Unity? I want to get a sense of why Unity, why there?
Yeah, I mean, like you kind of said it there, driving cars around, it's basically a physical limitation. How many cars can you drive around for how long, You can basically think about generating that equivalent type of data, simulating a car driving down a street in a city using a game engine like Unity, And you can do that at massive scale. You can run 10,000, you can run 100,000 instances. You can drive millions, if not billions of miles virtually. You can create all kinds of crazy scenarios that you are unlikely to actually ever meet, except when they happen, once in a while. So you can basically generate the data that you need to train these systems, and you can drive billions of miles, as I said, and you're not really going to hurt anyone while doing that.
So this seems like a big deal because in some ways, so this is sort of generating a synthetic data set, but because you have real physics in these engines, because you get it for free, sort of, because Unity has physics for these games. If I'm racing cars, if I'm jumping and diving, and you can use that physics, it probably things fall at 9.2 meters per second squared or something, and all the rest. And how do you end up simulating all the craziness of pedestrians though? Like, how do you simulate the non-vehicle part of it? Humans seem odd in this space, and I'm curious about like what you do for that to create many of these scenarios, or how does that happen?
Yeah, there's several ways of doing this, but I want to emphasize one thing here, which is that at its very basic level, a game engine is built to entertain a human, yeah. So it plays at 30 or 60 frames per second. It has physics in there. It's a 3D environment, and time goes on and stuff happens, yeah. When we look at the engine being used for training computer systems, for training AI systems, we can basically dial that frame rate up. We can generate thousands of frames per second if that's needed. Yeah, we can do it on thousands or hundreds of thousands of instances. So scale matters here, because how do I actually have agents or humanoids in these simulations behave in reasonable ways? Yeah, well, I do that by basically creating distributions of behavior. Yeah, I can train computer systems to actually understand generalized human behavior, and then I can start randomizing this. I can have people running out in front of vehicles once in a while. It does not have to be like exact human behavior, whatever that is, because through massive scale, by actually generating trillions of frames, you can create a lot of scenarios that may or may not be realistic, but in total, what you enable the AI system to do is to generalize and basically learn how to predict dangerous behavior from a pedestrian, or how to avoid a bicyclist, etc.
So I remember reading about a study out of UC Santa Cruz that that they actually tried to get the business models from a few different autonomous vehicles, let's say Waymo, et cetera, and look at what they were doing if they were acting as ride shares. And they simulated what they would do in downtown San Francisco and downtown other places. And what they found was that the cars, there might be low cost places to park the car robotically. The robot could drive to the edges of the city where the cheap parking was, but they didn't, because their model was always be there within a very short period of time to get the ride, the person. And so what they found was that autonomous vehicles' economic model was stay close, but people living in a city kind of don't want traffic jams. But what it would do is it would create traffic jams, like about a block or two away from where the pedestrian or the user was going to come out, so that they could be close. So they noticed that the economic model in the AI brain that for the cars didn't match up with maybe either the way that people pay for public infrastructure, like meters, or convenience for people that drive their own cars. What are the kinds of things you're seeing actual companies do with this? Not people building games, but people like actually trying to figure out how to use Unity for this.
Yeah, you're raising a wonderful point, because that is exactly why you need simulation. Yeah. When we are going into a world where we don't write the requirement spec as we did in the old days, give it to the developers and they implement exactly to spec, but that we move into data-driven approaches, we have to be very careful what rewards, how we define our rewards function, yeah? Because AI systems, they have a strong tendency to optimize really well, and you get a lot, you may get a lot of unwanted and even unintended consequences from that. Yeah, so that's why we actually use simulation, and industries are using simulations to basically try out what the optimal policy should be. We actually did a demo of simulating behavior in a grocery store during COVID. And basically finding out, how many people should be in the store, how does that impact the number of registers, because it's not a good idea to stand in line in the store for a very long time. Does one-way aisles work, etc. We ran 100,000 different simulations and got some ideas about what good policies would be to implement in these stores. Yeah. So simulation is a way to really get insight before you deploy a policy.
So, Danny, I have a question. The world of simulation, of course, goes back 50 or 60 years, as it was, whether it was the work that the dynamic modeling that the Meadows were doing or stochastic modeling. And then you had the world of gaming that started. But somehow, at some point, the world of gaming seemed to pick up and accelerate and be the richest platform for everybody to show up at and do more. including what you've done. So can you give us, is this simply because consumers and kids demanded so much to be entertained and so much talent went in to designing these virtual worlds that suddenly became a better platform to build on than somebody else's enterprise platform?
Yeah, you're spot on. This is what's happening. Gaming is a very competitive space. We have hundreds and hundreds of developers working on our engine and making sure that it runs on over 30 different platforms at a commercial level, that you can actually deploy a successful game on iOS and Android and Xbox and PlayStation and PC and Mac, and I go on and on and on. Yeah. So all that investment goes into creating an entertainment platform. But isn't it wonderful you can take that same entertainment platform and actually change the whole space of simulation?
Historically, well, it also seems...
Sorry?
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Historically, simulation has been, about, precision physics, dynamic modeling. I mean, like, if you look at a pilot, it's about how to fly a plane and not crash it, which is good. But it's not been a lot about how people collaborate and how they interact together.
I keep remembering Grand Theft Auto and early games where people would just not do the thing you wanted them to do, or maybe you wanted them to do. It was sort of open world. People would just drive around. They would like see if they could get their car onto the top of the subway train and then ride the subway on top of, through things and stuff like that. And I think this idea of an open world where people experiment and do things you wouldn't have predicted feels like that might be really useful for policies beyond policy just for a car, but almost system of system policies. Like, what are the interactions between the car policies and the interactions between the city planner or the citizens policies, or all the ways that we kind of have to interact together. Are you seeing that happening? Are you seeing people starting to look at this kind of at multi-level or multi-system kind of intersections?
Yes, actually, that is actually the real point here, where the game engines, the multiplayer technology, is really going to impact how we analyze situations before we implement them. Yeah, we can actually try out simulated policies and then actually have humans involved, like it's a multiplayer game, and interact with those policies and interact with each other, and then basically learn from that.
So one thing you mentioned when we did the pre-call that I thought was fascinating is you said because so many people play games and simulations on the Unity platform, you're able to somehow do almost like a study of studies of all the different ways even game mechanics work, and start to kind of give suggestions back to the developers about the game mechanics. Am I getting that right? Or could you talk a little bit about that, which is kind of an interesting kind of meta insight that you can get?
That's true. We got over 2 billion, well over 2 billion players every month playing a game made with Unity. Yeah. And what we see is a lot of different behavior. And some of the new technologies, such as deep learning, is really efficient in trying to capture the essence of that behavior. We have a policy, and we don't actually have a need. We don't want to know who you are, where you live, your gender, your name, any of that kind of stuff. What we're looking at is your behavior and what kind of games you like, how you play them. And we can basically use that information at Unity to hook you up with games that we think we have a very, you have a very high likelihood of really appreciating. So it's interesting how to take human behavior, only look at human behavior, not actually try to get into privacy land and all this stuff where some other corporations, they get in. We don't want to go there.
There are these two sides. There's the entertainment side, and you see all of these artificial worlds, whether it's Animal Crossing or World of Warcraft, but they're artificial worlds. And then you have people who are working on digital twins in their cities and Uber. And I'm wondering how those come together. For example, so many people who are in schools or entrepreneurs, or I'm sure our audience, are interested in how you simulate and build a better world. What economic policies might work? How do you create local economies that don't crash and aren't extractive? So all of these real world questions would be really interesting to dump into a simulation that was also fun. It might be fun to completely crash and screw up an economy to learn how to do that well. Are we seeing things that bring the world of serious simulation into the world of consumers?
Yeah. I would say consumers is probably a stretch, but one of the things we have been doing at Unity is to make sure that we give a broad range of researchers and developers, and that includes students, access to Unity. And we have created toolkits that allow them to actually use advanced technologies such as reinforcement learning to simulate and train small AI systems where they can really explore what it means to create a good rewards function for teaching an agent to solve a problem. Yeah. So we are trying to, in a sense, to democratize AI by bringing it to the doorsteps of universities and schools. And we would definitely also love to go that step further and actually meet the casual creator and enable them to use these technologies in meaningful ways.
So I feel like this would be a good time to bring in our next guest, Kristen, because in some ways, testing out the policies of things, before you do them with the robot cars and the robot drones and things like that, or products that we design, it feels like it'd be really fun to understand how this kind of a opportunity to simulate, a decade in an evening or something, or look at all the behaviors, how many that might be a bounty or a potential for behavioral science and for us understanding things. Let's bring in Kristen.
Hey there, great conversation.
So Kristen, were you able to listen in on that? Do you have any first questions for Danny? And then I'd just love to have you tell us a little bit of your background and how you ended up creating Irrational Labs.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the interesting things you're doing is so in behavior change, we do the same thing almost every day in the same way, most of us, right? We have incredibly ingrained habits. And so kind of, I don't know how many folks know about this explore exploit model, which is basically usually you have the option to, if you're moving to a new city, go to new restaurants and you do this and you explore, and at some point you find your favorite restaurants and then you exploit it. And typically what humans do is we exploit a little bit too early, where we could really have a better explore model, which would increase the likelihood that we just have more enjoyment, but we exploit something early enough because it's comfort, because decisions are hard for a variety of reasons that are not terrible. So I think in these simulated worlds, it's very interesting to think if we can help people explore more and really kind of dabble with new ways of either personal behavior or societal behavior. Libby Moss, or I think that's her name is Libby Schaaf, sorry, the mayor of Oakland, basically came out in a small group, said, governments are not about experimenting. And so we have very little hope of kind of our cities or our governments doing it by themselves. So I think there's a really interesting way where we could say, how do we get small experiments within a simulated world to happen? So I'd be interested, basically, maybe, Dan, if you've thought about how you help people exploit more or explore more and avoid the exploit. So
I don't know if you've been cheating and watching one of my talks, but I have in 9 out of 10 talks, I have the exploration to exploitation chart. And,
wow.
and I want to mention, it's actually one of the most crucial things about machine learning and the use of machine learning at a company like Amazon. It is basically that everything you see on the page is curated just for you. And it's not just, as we all joke and say, I browse shoes and then I see shoes everywhere. Well, at Amazon, they're really, really good at also showing other things. And they really probe, because it's what you click on that matters, but it's also important what you see and don't click on. Yeah. So Amazon is really, really good as one of those companies that really figure this out, how to explore all the time, and don't jump to conclusions and think that people are going to buy shoes for the rest of their life just because they bought one pair of shoes. Yeah. So I think that we as humans explore way too little. And I really think that simulation is sort of really a key to enable that mindset of let me experiment, let me explore, let me try. I actually tell everybody in my team, in my engineering team is like, fail fast, but because you have to experiment, you have to try stuff before you actually sort of figure it out and can start exploiting and can start, putting it into systems. Yeah. So simulation is one of the techniques you can do there to basically just probe the limits of what's possible.
Kristen, you mentioned the idea of applying this to experiments in cities. And one of the most interesting experiments that's going on now in, say, San Francisco is with the pandemic and the need to increase outdoor dining, we've completely simplified and relaxed some of the regulations about setting up restaurants in streets. And so it's easier to get the permit, it's faster, kind of doesn't quite matter what you construct. We suppress the immune system of how the city would react to something, or the parking things going away. And what we've seen is a great deal of experimentation and innovation and stuff that'll probably stick. And I bring this up because a few years ago, we did a project at Gray Area called Urban Prototyping, where we suppressed the regulations and we let teams of designers and architects and students build simulated structures in the street, like art things and reading things to sit on. But we had to like suppress the city planning rules. And I guess my question is, and people came up with ideas, they designed them in Autodesk and they deployed them. I'm wondering if there's some way that simulation can augment this. In other words, you have an hypothesis, you want to try something and see how people behave differently, but maybe we could simulate these things ahead of time and then pick the best ones, or take what we learned. We learned a lot when we measured all this, people on the streets. And if we can put that into a simulation and use that to then generate other forms of serendipity in cities. Do you follow that? Kind of connecting up the world of experimentalism to informing simulation and vice versa.
Yep. And I think it is something we would need. It's a complex problem, right? So basically we can make zoning easier. We can make, kind of urban planning easier for creators and developers. And yet we need a pandemic to actually get people to be open to it. Mm-hmm. So, there's been a lot of people putting benches in parks so that people could talk more, kind of putting art structures so that folks can have social engagements. And yet, they're fine, but they kind of go unused. And so the pandemic, I think, was a factor, like this unknown variable. I don't think anyone of us would have said, oh, the outdoor dining will only be successful if we have a pandemic to force people outside. So there's an interesting balance between understanding kind of making something easy, which is the first law of behavioral science, or like getting someone to do anything is you just make it a little easy, and pushing people out of their comfort zones to try something new, and the norms to do it. So I think in a simulation, there's a question on how do we create the tipping point by which when you see your neighbors do it, you'll do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of is some of the essence of what moves behavior more or less.
So Kristen, tell us a little bit about Irrational Labs and about kind of the work that you do. I remember we were driving down to Santa Cruz to go to a camp out or something like that. And I'd never met you before, but we used a Google Doc to match up rides, people who had a ride and had a car and needed a ride. And you were telling me about a plan to like take over a bar or restaurant and actually have like a control on the second floor and the actual like experiment on the first floor and all sorts of cool things. But before we go there, I want you to wind back a little bit and tell me what's going on with Irrational Labs. What is it?
So Dan Ariely, who's a behavioral economist and professor at Duke, and I started Irrational Labs now close to 10 years ago with really the idea of taking behavioral economics out of the lab and into the hearts and minds of companies, really focused on behavior change for good. So this is around nudging people, changing the environment to increase someone's health, wealth, and happiness. So if you go to a bank and currently, not a lot of people are paying their loans on time, or if they're not saving enough, we don't think that that's really because the person doesn't want to do it. We think that's the environment of the decision making. So that's how the deposit form is designed. That's how many steps it takes you to do the savings. So our hypothesis on how to get anyone to do anything is really about changing the little dials and nodes, and companies are the best at this. So we worked with Google for 3 years, working within their teams, over 25 teams, to do small experiments on behavior change, again, all for good. And then kind of over the last years have done fintech and have done health, and really trying to understand how to nudge people to do the things that they want to do. And the bar experiment is interesting because if you think about our social infrastructure, you go to a bar to meet somebody, And bars aren't actually helpful at this, right? You stand there and it's very difficult to talk to somebody new. And if you do, you feel a little bit trapped. And so it's not lack of motivation that people have when they're at a bar to meet somebody new. And so the question is, how would you design a bar if you really wanted to help people connect? And you know, a group of friends and some folks on our team tried some different things. But actually, I think this is one question where a simulation actually would be very interesting to try to figure out. You know, there's infinite ways you could try to get people to talk at a bar, and one of the ways we tried was just having a greeter and having people meet each other and then taking them away after 5 minutes if just to relieve them of the burden of having to finish the conversation.
Vicky, you're muted. And now you're unmuted.
Probably the safest way for me to just be muted. You know, what I like about that, Kristen, is the notion that, you know, if I'm actually having a good conversation with somebody, I can exchange numbers. I can like wait until that person who dragged me away disappears and then I'll come back. But it's kind of like having a deus ex machina, just this, you know, something outside of our control to give us the ability to explore a little bit more or try things. What are the things that you see have worked most successfully for actually habit change, like for actually helping people be healthier, wealthier, happier, you know, those things?
Yeah. So I'll offer two principles. One is what we call the window of opportunity. So, and this is again kind of the explore exploit idea. Most studies that focus on habit change have very small effects. It's very difficult to do and sustain over time, except if you control or you use basically the people who have just moved locations. So they've just moved homes or they've just moved jobs. If you isolate and look at just these people, and look at them within the 3-month window after they get the intervention. So you can imagine, actually researchers in the UK did this. They took folks, try to nudge them to do environmentally sound behaviors, turn off the lights, take the bus, use less water, all these great things. And they found, very sadly, you know, they report no effects except for the people who had just moved homes. And so the idea here is that, again, it's we're very stable creatures, but if you can change and hack your environment, this is what will help us do anything different. And then I think the second thing, again, this isn't rocket science, but just making things easy. So kind of the only reason Americans have retirement savings right now is because we have automatic enrollment. And, you know, it's not, you would ask people and say they don't want retirement savings, but turns out if they don't have automatic enrollment, they don't have retirement savings. So I think that also highlights how bad we are as humans at predicting our future behavior and understanding why we do something. Like nobody, we actually did this survey. We asked people why they're saving for retirement, and 0.2% of people mentioned anything about automatic enrollment or the default, right? And so we're just really bad at understanding the reasons why we behave the way we do. And so it's difficult to ask people to assess what would change their behavior. That's why we need experimentation and AI.
I'm wondering about these.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. Oh, Peter, do you have a question?
Well, we might have been heading the same place, but there's a connection between these two, because you point out that like humans are incredibly sloppy and unreliable at optimizing themselves. And so we have behavioral economics and AI. Yet in the machine learning world, we often talk about the fact that as machines learn how we behave, and in things like Facebook, understand how to very well deliver us what we want, we almost have machines learning what we want and how we should behave faster than we are. So I'm wondering about this. And also, Danny, are you, as you start training, your traffic simulations or city simulations, is part of this learning sets from how people behave so that machines get really good at predicting or perhaps even manipulating us? Because it seems that behavioral economics can train kind of rapid machine learning how to best exploit or direct us. And I'm wondering at that interface what's going on, because there's probably good that can happen and bad that can happen.
I actually want to take the opportunity. I get your question or your point, but I actually want to take the opportunity and just share with you some of the things that fascinate me the most with the combination of simulation and AI. And that is that we use reinforcement learning. We train from scratch. We have little cubes, we have little characters moving around doing things, and we give them assignments. And more often than not, we see something that we think as humans, we recognize as very intelligent and complex behavior, and we see these little agents do it, and we recognize human behavior there or animal behavior. I want to give you a couple of examples. We had a virtual robot puppy, a dog, being trained with the reward function, which is return the stick when I throw it. So I use my mouse, I throw the stick, and it gets really good at fetching the stick and bring it back and deliver to me, because then it can get another rewards point when it brings the stick back. Yeah, it's very simple. It runs on a laptop. Yeah. At one point, I moved the stick left and right to sort of see if I can get the dog to roll over, just for the fun of it. Of course, it wouldn't roll over, but what it did is that it just grabbed the stick from me, turned around and dropped it again. Yeah, so it took the stick from me, which is a very normal behavior from dogs. And here you have a very small computer system that took that behavior in. It was apparently very fundamental. Yeah? I think a lot of human behavior, we see glimpses of it, like with concept agents, that if they can cheat, they cheat. If they can walk around a wall instead of learning to climb it, they will walk around the wall. Yeah.
So can I ask? Okay, so in some of the behavioral studies, people behave a little bit different when it's they're playing against a computer, than they're playing against another human. And when they're playing against a computer, they actually do cheat more. They're more selfish and more rational. And we think that's because of kind of it's more of anonymous behavior, and you have less reciprocity. So I wonder, kind of as we do the simulations, like, do we want people to be playing against computers because they're not acting necessarily, they're acting more rational, but maybe less.
Oh, we might get the wrong signal. Yeah.
Yeah. What do we think?
Isn't it what pollsters they run into? They ask people, and people won't admit to who they actually vote for, and then they say something else. I've heard about that. I think that it is an interesting, very, very interesting phenomenon, because people get very honest in front of the computer, and they behave very different in front of people. But I think go ahead.
I don't know if it's honesty so much as, I think we should separate the two of honesty and reciprocity. So honesty, there's nice studies where basically if you put a computer but you have eyes looking at you, you actually are more honest. Kismet is the name of the robot, and the Kismet's looking at you, and you're more honest. And so that's like kind of a less, the feeling and anonymity drives our dishonesty in those simulations or in those games. And then there's reciprocity, which is more of an altruism thing. And that's, I think, what I'm more worried about is like when we lose altruism at some level because we're playing life with a computer. I don't know if I should be worried. I just am. As we think about kind of moving more to abstract things that we're interacting with all the time.
Well, I think, one of the things I remember hearing about in SimCity 2015 or so was that the lead designer designing the game mechanics wanted to make it more real, verisimilitude, and put in yellow people that represented homelessness. And when you started playing the game, you could try different tactics to reduce homelessness. But what happened was, if the city was big enough or the system got complex enough, they were always overrun by homeless people. And people would send EA emails like, there's a bug in your system, it's got homeless people, and these yellow people keep showing up. And the designer and EA responded, that's not a bug. If you can show us a way to reduce homelessness, we're happy to give you the controls to do it. And there was this idea that there's always a donut in a simulation. There's always a hole in the middle, because it's not reality. It's the thing that you don't simulate that sometimes amplifies and brings attention to something, or it's the thing you forgot. It's the variable you weren't able to account for. How would, like, if you were doing a collaboration together, Kristen, Irrational Labs, and Danny, Unity, what would you do together? I mean, you've got access to, I think I wrote it down, 2 billion people making behaviors a month. Like, what could you do that would actually be pro-social, that would be positive, that might be actually help us with your things, Kristen? Or Danny, what would you do with the Rational Labs? Like, what would be the experiment or the interface there? I'm kind of curious.
I don't know where to begin, Kristen. There's so many possibilities here, yeah, because you have a fantastic audience, a very, very engaged audience, and when you create these games and you run these games, you get reaction, and you capture that reaction. Yeah, you see every little click, every little movement you can capture, and I mean, like, you can learn so much about people by what actually it's back to your exploration. Yeah, we can explore with people and figure out, what makes them engaged, what makes them pursue something in a game.
Kristen, what about on your end? What would you think?
Yeah, I think it's so exciting to think about how we learn about basically what you said in the beginning is where games are really entertaining people. And so I think if you could like point for a week all the developers into thinking about how would you get somebody to like call their mom or be a little bit nicer to their family, or have a meaningful conversation at work that would increase their meaning and purpose. So I think there are some of these like hard to design because we don't create the environment. In a game, the game designers create the full environment. In an offline, we don't create the full environment. The person's living it. And so it's a hard thing to study, but I think, if we could like bring it into a world and say, how would you get someone to be a little bit nicer to their family, or have more meaning and purpose in work? These types of problems are hard for behavioral science to study because they're longer term. And so you need repeated games basically to do it. Whereas behavioral science is really good at studying kind of like one RCT, where we have like one experiment and intervention, and then we look maybe at outcomes 2 to 3 months down the road from the one intervention. But we're bad at studying repeated games in the real world, right? So obviously the prisoner's dilemma and things, those are lab experiments. And so, I think the merge of kind of a simulated repeated game experiment with kind of pro-social type things would be fascinating.
Well,
I
wonder about. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to say, since you and I met, and then it kind of Unity went on my mailing list, I've noticed that a lot of what comes out from Unity are techniques and tips to game developers on how you engage, how you motivate behavior, what works. I think you talked about the fact that you can optimize this stuff. So it does create this compelling concept of how could you actually then simulate or see or build a game that motivates this kind of social behavior, right? You spend a lot of time on how you motivate behavior.
Yeah, no, actually, Kristen, you mentioned the environment, and when you say environment, a game environment, we have to include the player, or even if it's a multiplayer game, you have to include all the players in that environment. They're part of the environment, and that's so fascinating about games. I mean, like if I make a TV show or a movie, it's sort of one-way communication. Yeah, it is what it is. But when you sort of spend hours and hours in a game and you're multiple people in there, and now you're part of that environment, you start changing the environment, it opens up for many opportunities. I mean, like for studio, well, if people get in the environment and they make it really boring, they're all gonna leave, yeah? So that's why we give studios a lot of these tips of how to be successful. We want them to be successful in creating games, yeah? And these games need to engage people. And if you disengage people, they just leave the environment and they're lost. Yeah.
This might be a wonderful. Oh, go ahead. I was going to say then we could bring in Kate, who spends her life finding these techniques, building great games, and engaging people. But go ahead, Kristen. You were about to make a point.
Yeah, I think this is some of the problem with kind of pro-social behaviors, or is it, like they're actually just not that fun. So like you think about eating healthy, it's like just not that interesting to do. And so I think that's where the innovation has to come, is like, how do you get eating healthy to be fun, interesting, exciting, pride, reputation, progress, and, weight loss is long, hard, and you don't see feedback after you've eaten a salad. And so it's really, some of these real world behaviors need kind of the entertainment value to drive us. And I think it's a scary thing, because as we think about, is that just then the attention economy that we're helping, and yet kind of some of that's the human condition. So
you've described in many ways the master problem that has emerged when people look at the effect of Facebook on us, right? It's so easy
Yeah.
for Facebook to reinforce the most titillating thing or the conspiracy thing. And that's so powerful that the big question that everybody's asking is, what's the thing that might be better than that you don't get through regulation or just cutting off Facebook, but it's just a more powerful and attractive thing, but also tends towards something that is building or constructive. It may be the biggest question facing our race with the rise of these powers.
But I wonder too about Kristen, you said something about norms early on. And I think that's kind of interesting because the games probably create a physics and a set of norms based on the rules, and I keep thinking about just the weird games that I've played. And I wonder, you've learned in the irrational lab studies, things like if you just put the apples closer to the checkout line in the cafeteria or 5 feet away, it changes how much people eat healthier. Or if the bowl is slightly smaller, they don't, because we'll just eat until we eat. And if the norm is big bowls, then you'll eat more. And I wonder if there's some way to create an experiment that starts letting us experiment with norms and evolutions of norms or rituals that then might translate to the physical world. I keep thinking about how there are like the newest Alexa has a motor in it so that it can dance with you in the kitchen when it's doing yoga, the screen, and it can follow you around. That's the Amazon 10, right? And then I start thinking, whoa, okay, our things, which is the environment, just like people, our things might actually react to us in our physical world based on some play that happens in a virtual world, or where the boundary is. And is there a way that we might build new interesting behaviors? I'm thinking more about how the norms might evolve or change. If I threw something in the garbage can, I remember the fun theory from Volkswagen a few years ago, and they went to garbage cans in Central Park, and they put like a sensor, so when you threw something in the garbage can, it made this noise like woo, like it was the world's deepest garbage can. And you see like people like all running around trying to throw things in because they want to hear how far down it goes before it hits the ground. And I know that's silly, and probably you'd get bored of it after a while. But I'm just curious about how we start taking advantage of the fact that these sensors are not only helping us with things like autonomous cars, but they're starting to be embedded pretty pervasively around us, and they seem to be starting to have robotic controls. And what does that mean, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think my dream experiment would be paying kind of in lower income communities, there's not time or money to work out. And so nobody does it. And so it'd be very weird in a community like this to go for a run outside. And so you can imagine having actors just run in communities that exercise outside is not normal. And so that's the question really would be like, how quickly could you get someone to change their behavior by seeing other people
by shifting the norm? Yeah.
And so like in a game, the question is like what perceptions of norms are we given implicitly by seeing other people act, or how the game is designed, and do we take that into our real world? And can we it'd be expensive and weird to maybe pay people to run outside, but what other things could we do in a simulated environment that would change our perceptions?
Why don't we bring Kate?
Let's bring Kate on.
Kate, I'd love your take on what we've been talking about so far, but also you are the master experimentalist, having built and deployed so many games and learned so much about actually how people spend time and what motivates them.
Yeah, I'm very proud of a lot of the things I've built. And I guess the one that I'm most proud of is the Twitter bot platform that I helped make, which is Cheap Bots Done Quick, runs 10,000 bots, most of which are made by children and poets and other non-coders. And so just watching people make bots to please each other.
What do the bots do? Like what's an example of a bot? Or how, when you say that, what are the kids making just for fun?
Yeah. So the technology is like super simple. It's what's called a context-free grammar, but you can really think of it as just Mad Libs for computers. So you write your little, maybe I want to have something that generates procedural cocktail recipes. So I want like something to make like little silly hipster cocktail drinks. So like, what's a drink? A drink is a like hashtag ingredient and a hashtag ingredient combined in a hashtag container garnished with a hashtag object. And you can kind of recursively define those things. And eventually you get something that's like, and I'm putting all this stuff in there myself as a bot author. So I might end up with something that's like, okay, Virgin Kahlua and house-made Grand Marnier garnished with a bicycle. As weird or as normal as I want. And yeah, so people have made lots of these bots, and there's everything from like little, there's Tiny Care Bot, which just sends you self-help messages like, I love you, please drink some water, like go outside today. On the opposite end, but also kind of as a therapy bot, there's Infinite Scream, which is I think probably the most popular bot running on that platform, which just 3 times an hour goes at different lengths. But if you reply to it, it'll go back at you. And so people will have these like long conversations with it and will often tag it in when they post a news story. So speaking of things like rituals, people have interesting little rituals around these bots.
Kate, who are you? Who is Kate Compton? What are you doing with these little casual game things and casual?
Yeah, I have a mission statement, which is to bring AI to the people that AI doesn't deserve. Basically, I really love the concept of AI, and I think there's a lot of things that people who are not sort of PhDs at large corporations can add to the conversation, especially kind of expressive AI. So AI, I'm really glad that people are making sort of intense utility AI to drive cars and not run into people. There's also weird, strange, idiosyncratic AI, like Infinite Scream, where nobody would sit down at Unity and say, like, what we really need to do is have a 6-month project to build something that screams 3 times an hour. But you have, once you get this number of people, 10,000 people making things, you get this wonderful Cambrian explosion of people trying everything. And you discover spaces. If this tool hadn't existed, we wouldn't know what Twitter bots are for. I don't remember what Twitter bots were made before this, but it was not terribly interesting. And so there's a concept that I've been bouncing around, and excuse the mild profanity, which is basically the speed of shitpost, which is the idea that like if you have a terrible idea that is funny for you only for a very short period of time. So Infinite Scream was maybe funny for 10 minutes. But maybe 10 minutes was all it took for that person who came up with it, Nora Reed, to implement it. If it had been 6 months to implement that, they would have never built this bot. And so on platforms where the speed of shitpost is very low, you can develop these Cambrian explosions, which actually figure out what weird niches exist, what purposes. And on platforms where you don't have that, you end up not getting that. This is why I think Twitter bots have exploded. And yet, if I asked you to describe your favorite Alexa skill, you probably couldn't, because to make an Alexa skill is, multi-week project. So you cannot shitpost an Alexa skill.
So you're enabling people to do this play, and I know you have tracery as well, and I don't know how that relates. Can you tell us?
Yeah, tracery is what
tracery?
runs cheap bots.
Or is that the machinery?
Yep, it's the same thing. Yep.
So that lets you build these procedural grammars. But what I think is fascinating is you've spent a lot of study and a lot of time, like looking even at the history of procedural things. What do you mean when you say procedural? Like, what is that to the average audience member? What is a procedure?
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to explain sometimes, but it's really what can we make in collaboration with a system that would be sort of inhuman otherwise? So you can even think of things like, I have a pottery wheel. And that pottery wheel is a mechanism that allows me to make smoother and rounder pots than I would have otherwise. There are little wheels that you can get to attach to your pottery wheel that will allow you to make absolutely geometrically perfect patterns around it. And then you think about spirographs, which work very much in the same way. That's another generative system where, okay, if I just wanted to draw, I could draw anything. But if I put my pencil inside of this like weird little gear toy, suddenly I can draw these exquisitely inhumanly perfect geometric shapes. So it's this combination of generating something with some sort of system, which is often a computer nowadays, but it didn't have to be for most of the history. So generating something, and often it surprises me. So things like we mentioned the dice music from Mozart. The idea would be that you would kind of create infinite numbers of little polonaises or waltzes. And if you got bored of one, you could just generate more of them.
And this really existed. There was like a pair of dice and a set of small things back.
Yeah, you would have these like 1700s. I know it was also one of the first cases of IP one of the first cases I found of IP infringement where it was like labeled as being from Mozart, but was in fact not from Mozart. And you would just like, there were a set of bars of music for a waltz, and you would roll the dice, get your bar, paste that in, roll the dice, get another bar, paste that in. So it was really just sort of a cut and paste job.
Was the intent of it, was it the hacking of its day? Was it like trying to spoof and play with it? What do you think the mentality was behind that? Because it's very hacky behavior.
Yeah, I found a number of these, and I forget the title of one of them, but it's got one of those wonderfully long 1700s title, like for the amusement of people, create perhaps 10,000 different polonaises for the for the delight
it's got
of
the
your
flowery
parlor.
nature. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you see what's happening with what Danny's working on, the Unity platforms and the richness of simulation, or what Kristen is doing with sort of trying to understand how to help motivate people or help them realize that the things they think will make them happy, like buying something for yourself, versus the things that actually make you happy might be treating somebody else. What's your reaction, or how do you consume that kind of information in your world of experimentation and in your world of play and gaming?
Gosh, I don't know. So a lot of my stuff is about getting people to be social together, or getting people to sort of share, well, originally I was interested in creativity, but it turns out the biggest use of creativity is just for people to communicate with each other or to form communities online. So that's really my sphere. I have not done anything at all with, how do you, on the more practical side, how do you change people's minds? It's really just, my side is creativity seems to make people happy and delighted and socially connected. So I think the best that I've got of how can creativity fight against all the ills of social media is maybe if we connect with people more honestly in creativity, we won't have to sort of drink the 0-calorie Diet Coke of social interaction that is just like retweeting awful things.
Speaking of moments of social interaction, this show, of course, is called Quarantine, where we launched because we became obsessed with innovation in this moment. And if there's one thing people have been spending an enormous amount of time on, it is in gaming environments and social gaming environments. So I would love to kind of hear, Kate and Danny, from your experience, what have we been seeing? Kate, what have we been seeing in how people communicate in different environments? And Danny, you must be seeing really interesting stuff across your platform as people are at home and living in a virtual world, not a real one.
Yeah, I would say the thing that I would tell people is if there are people on it, it's a social gaming platform. So one of my absolute favorite innovations, which I bring up all the time, and people who know me are probably sick of hearing about it, but it's called spreadsheet parties. And these are, so if you have a Google spreadsheet, so Google spreadsheets are designed for doing lots of work, for, arranging who has cars on field trips, things like that. And so you can put lots of people on them and they can all be editing it simultaneously. It's a really great, really reliable tool that Google has polished the heck out of. But if you put a whole bunch of people on it and you don't say, figure out who has the best car for our road trip, you say, okay, we're just going to have this very strange combination of a concrete poetry jam and a quilting bee, where there's, some number of us, all anonymous, just filling out squares in a Google spreadsheet as much as we want. Some people are painting emoji pictures, some people are adding to the emoji pictures, some people are kind of drawing long, complicated routes down. One of the most common things that people do in these parties, I've run 3 of them so far, is you scroll all the way down to, I think there's some number of thousands of rows in a Google Sheet, and you kind of make an interesting little vignette at the bottom of the world that only people who scrolled all the way down will find. So you're kind of hiding little secrets from each other and like building out this world and kind of embroidering it all together in a sort of playful, experimental misuse of a completely normal tool.
Well, I like the experimental misuse, and I actually think I'm surprised to hear about it. But then again, I think a spreadsheet was like one of the very first useful tools that actually made the PC revolution useful, because it was a generative grid. You could put different things on the vertical and the horizontal, and that immediately leads to this explosion of possibilities. Danny, what about you? What are you seeing on the gaming stuff during COVID, particularly? Or Kristen, what are you seeing in terms of effective things that are helping people with either happiness or health in this weird time?
I think it's interesting to see sort of the boost of Zoom. I mean, like, a lot of people is bashing Zoom and Zoom fatigue and stuff like that. But it is essentially a tool to communicate. Yeah? And we have also seen that people choose to play games. I don't know the statistics here, but I have a sense that people probably go to Zoom and games more than they dial in on a TV channel to get entertained. Yeah. So we've seen games like Fall Guys, Among Us, all made with Unity, being extremely popular over the last few months. We saw a very well-known politician play Among Us on Twitch yesterday with hundreds of thousands of people watching over her shoulder. Yeah, I mean, like
that was AOC, right? I think I remember hearing about that.
And I want to take, this is a COVID crisis. This is a very bad thing, but within it, there are some silver linings of seeing how people use technology to break the captivity, to the loneliness of being at home, yeah, and basically get out and interact with other people. And I'm very happy to be a part of, enabling that process.
Yeah, this is a time of intense media experimentation. It gets back to the point we made at the beginning, which is it took a crisis to get people to try new stuff on the streets with the outdoor, tables and chairs that were permitted for restaurants. But we saw at the very beginning, when people realized they were at home, enormous experiment. One of our earlier episodes was on people who were experimenting with Zoom parties, combining of Discord with Zoom, gaming with Zoom, all of this mix and matching of pieces of media. And of course, your description of the spreadsheet, which if you go back and think about it, it's kind of a goofy little virtual world that's spatial. We ought to have you come back on the show with Bob Frankston, who with Dan Bricklin invented VisiCalc. And it would be fun to have Frankston, who did not know he was building a communications medium when he was writing this thing for the Apple II. But that would be a very fun conversation to have.
So one of the first things I did on Zoom, Kristen had given me this book, which was a deck of cards with different questions on it that are really fascinating to do with people you don't know. Like you're sitting around a table. And what's the deck of cards called, or what's this?
Yeah, this is our no small talk deck. I'll post the link. We've now 2 packs. One is kind of the safe for work, and one is the very not safe for work. Because as soon as you do a little bit of the safe for work, you're like, let's up the ante here.
No small talk.
Yeah, no small talk. We tend to go to as Kate said, just the lowest common denominator of conversation in most situations. And so anything that could kind of push us out of it, I call it social paternalism, where you have to kind of have some lubricant in there to help people get out. But even a deck of cards could be the lubricant for folks to use.
Here's the question. Peter, I want you to answer this question if you can read it. If you could change anything about the way you were raised, in past episodes we've heard about your insanely epic mother, who's still on the board of NPR or something crazy at 93. But if you could change anything about the way you were raised, what would it be?
Right. It would have been fun if they taught me to ski earlier or learn a foreign language earlier, because we're more plastic and able to do these things earlier. So in retrospect, that would have been cool. I could.
Danny.
Danny, how about you?
No, I'm going to ask you a totally different question.
Fine.
If you could wake up tomorrow having gained a superpower, having gained any one quality or ability, what would it be? If you woke up tomorrow and you just gained something that you don't have.
Oh my God, that's a difficult question. Oh God, that's awful. I can't answer that. What would that be?
By the way, this is actually okay. I think many times in conversation we're pressed to have an immediate answer, because in the business world we need immediate answers. But actually, the beauty of conversation is you can think out loud, talk about it, play with it. So Danny, maybe we move on, but then you think about it. That's a good question.
I'm going to go ask my mom the question. If you could have changed anything about how you raised me, what would you have done? Because it really is a provocative question. It's a great question.
Kate, did you get it?
Oh yeah, what's the strangest thing about where I grew up?
Yeah.
I grew up on 47 acres of bucolic Ohio countryside, and my parents' window had a bullet hole in it because it was so bucolic that we attracted hunters. We weren't actually allowed to have this sort of magical Calvin and Hobbes backyard experience that I always wanted growing up.
Did you have to like wear a bright orange jacket sometimes of the year?
We just had to stay in the meadow areas where there wasn't tall grass and not in the sort of back 47.
So, Kristen, I know you're going to have to leave pretty soon. Anything that last words or things that you're seeing from a behavioral science side that you just would love more people to know about, or that you're finding happening, or would encourage?
Let's see. I love the idea of this hurricane effect. So the hurricane effect is fascinating, that after hurricanes, people buy insurance for hurricanes. So this is the exact wrong time to buy insurance for any natural disaster. It's, you have the least likelihood of it actually occurring. But why people do is because you've just experienced a hurricane and you viscerally understand that it could happen to you. And before, it was far in the future and it could always happen to other people, and we had optimism bias, et cetera. And so I think COVID's a little bit like a hurricane, and we're being a little bit more proactive about our lives. One of my roommates, but I live with 14 people. That's another hack. But I
should have asked you the question about something.
Yeah,
you've hacked a special place in Oakland that's got 14 different people in it. Yeah.
But I think she, before COVID hit, she was kind of taking a backseat to finding a life partner. And when COVID hit, I think she realized more like she has to be proactive. Like things aren't just going to come to her. She's going to have to make this happen. And this is kind of a really, COVID's very shitty for single people. It's terrible. And yet kind of from it, like came this increased motivation and life design. So I think there's some positive things, silver lining here, that when we see something bad, like a hurricane, we'll take action we have not yet figured out to take.
Is there a way to bring the far off future? I mean, we have a lot of very slow moving that will suddenly become fast moving possible crises. And is there a way to, either use play or games or something to make it more visceral, to make it more immediate in some ways, so that we actually get that muscle or practice sooner? I remember hearing about in Cuba, everybody is incredibly well practiced. Like they have a drill randomly, but every month or two, where everyone in the small village has to know who needs to keep their medicine refrigerated, who's got dogs or cats that have to be taken care of. And they all basically do a drill of the whole village moving up into the mountains for the hurricane to be protected. And it's basically known in the world around as like this great practice that actually gets them so that they're not as badly affected by this. Are there any ways we might use games, or that we might do something that would actually bring our bad foresight or bad whatever closer to us, I guess?
It's possible. I mean, I do think it has to feel very visceral and real. So like in budgeting exercises, you can have people budget every period, and every period they underestimate it because they think that they'll, improve the next period on their spending. So we have different biases for different situations. So I think there are, the kind of the simulation would have to be specific to the environment we would want to drive towards. But I think it's a really interesting thought exercise to kind of, have kind of people have an emotional versus, utility-based interaction with something.
I mean, the way you're
it was actually pretty interesting.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it was actually really interesting for me. We kind of had that this year. So I lived in Santa Cruz, and our community evacuated from the wildfires. And a lot of us are burners. So we'd gone to Burning Man every year. And Burning Man can usually be described as Silicon Valley nerds cosplaying the apocalypse. And so we were used to having the correct amount of survival gear. So we all, before the fires, we already had all the really nice masks, because actually before the pandemic, we had the nice masks for Burning Man. So we all knew where those were. We all knew exactly how much stuff fit on our cars. We all knew kind of how to stack that stuff. And then as I was packing up my car to, flee my town, it felt weirdly detached. Like I wasn't freaking out because part of my head knew exactly in the muscle memory what I was doing. And so honestly, whenever there's an emergency, I like my muscles just freeze up, and yet suddenly they weren't because they knew this drill. So even though it was a totally different emotionally experience of like, oh boy, I'm going to go party, just having even though we had practiced in a game, we had not practiced like with the feeling. Having that practice really worked out.
You also practice in a real world game, right? You practiced at Burning Man. You'd gone through it. It wasn't virtual. You experienced it with many, many, many senses in many ways. And the point I was, which is a great example. Did you, by the way, move back to Santa Cruz, or did you stay evacuated?
I moved back there for a week, and then I came back to Chicago. So now I'm in Chicago.
You got it.
Totally safe.
I was going to ask a question.
Oh, Kristen's got to go. Kristen, thank you so much for staying past a little bit past 5. We appreciate it. Wonderful.
Nice to meet and exciting stuff. Have a great pandemic.
Yeah, perfect.
I was going to ask
you mentioned, well, before we go too much further, Kate, you mentioned your PhD thesis, and I just thought it would be interesting to kind of even bring it up a little bit, or bring up or share it with the audience. But you recently got your PhD from UC Santa Cruz, I think last year or so. And what was that thesis? Omid, can you bring that up on the screen?
Yeah, so it's the full thesis is 600 pages, and so I made a 16-page little comic book version of it. So that the intention is that like this would be useful for a lot of people who are designing apps or other software. And yeah, it's called Casual Creators, which is basically like me looking at things like the Sport Creature Creator and Spirograph and KidPix and a lot of these like little weird music doodling apps. Anything where you, it's what's called autotelic creativity, where you care more about the feeling of being creative than you actually do about the like byproduct. If you've ever known anybody who does the pottery wheel, they're not doing the pottery wheel because they desperately need more dishes. And often they'll start like shoving dishes at you because they've just made so many. So these are often things where like, it's just a pleasurable experience to kind of be pseudo creative. Bob Ross is also a really good example of kind of a casual creator experience. It's not so much that you need this painting, but you're going to feel the delight and safety and comfort and know that you are like safe in this creative space. And so, yeah,
I wonder if sometimes that's why some video games that actually allow you to create, the ones that aren't just I'm driving, but you can maybe build your own car, you can build your own thing. Just the act of that is fun, or the
there's
safety
safe little
and the
calm pools of creativity in amongst all the difficulty.
What did you learn? You worked on Spore and you worked on SimCity, and in Spore you brought in all sorts of techniques for people to build creatures and worlds, and in SimCity we were messing with cities, and I wonder if there are any lessons that came out of that might apply to the real world, jumping the shark from the simulated world to the real world.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just the biggest thing that came out of Spore for me was watching people grow and connect creatively. This was just amazing and deeply humbling that we'd made this tool, and we would often get like handwritten letters from people who said, I've written myself off creatively, and this made me feel like I could be creative again. And to see that, and then to also, we had this like online community where people could share their creations. And I don't think any of us on the team were prepared for just how much people communicated through that. Again, like I said, if there are people on it, it's a social platform. And so people would, we had not thought to include direct messages because we weren't a social platform. Why would we have direct messages? And so what people did was they would create a creation that was mailbox shaped and upload that as one of their creations. And then people would message them underneath that object. So if you didn't have some of these features, people would just hack them in because the human need to connect is just that powerful.
Yeah.
So Kate, I think that goes to your comment about niche creation and how the really fine edges of how people create their own niche. And I mean, we see this in nature as well, right? The beaver chews down in a bunch of trees, blocks the river, and that actually creates a niche for other organisms to kind of come in, and that shaping of the environment shapes it. And I imagine, Danny, in your world, a lot of the really interesting emergence comes from these niches. And how do you create them? How do studios create them? And then how do you help discover or people exploit them in some way. What are you seeing out there? Maybe to Peter's point too, either on the simulation but useful in the real world. We talked a little bit about that, but what do you see coming next? Or what do you see in terms of this kind of just the joy of creativity, or the connecting and growing together?
I think what Kate is doing is super, super important. I want to just give you a little story of I went to Beijing to give a talk about AI, and at that point, some individuals there, they pointed out how every high schooler in China was learning to program, to code, yeah. And I thought it was so interesting because my message was that we are beyond coding. The real deal of AI is that we as humans focus on what's special to us, which is the creativity. It's less with the future of AI and the capability of those systems. We're not going to code them any longer. Yeah, we're gonna train them. We're gonna show them, and that is so much harder. We don't get taught that in school. Yeah, we get, a lot of us get taught to be engineers, and then we go and write code, and the code is what I call Newtonian. Yeah, it's computable, it's predictable, it's deterministic. Yeah. And the world we live in, the society, nature, physics, yeah, that's actually Heisenberg's, yeah. It's full of uncertainty all the time. Even, at the quantum level, stuff is happening, and it's all basically distributions, yeah, of probabilities, yeah. And so back to the creative work, back to the casual creator, that skill is basically just completely undervalued. It's undertrained, and it's something that really is going to determine who's going to be successful in the future. Are you able to work with these AI systems? Are you able to get them to help you, or are you just going to mess up and get them to do the wrong things? Yeah. So I think that we're really going to ask ourselves some really hard questions going forward as these systems get better and better, and we basically have no role in writing a lot of code any longer, because that's being handled for us.
These will force us to figure out what it means to be human, because the other stuff is going to get handled.
Well, I remember, just to react to what you said, and maybe it picks up on a little bit of what Kate said. I remember when I was working at Autodesk, we were building a generative design tool, right? And so you would say, this gold matters, it has to be manufacturable out of 3D material made of this alloy, and it needs to be this easy for me to get my wrench in there, and it has to support this many newtons because it's a skateboard truck or whatever, and then you would generate a bunch of things, and they are all kind of boring or weird or whatever, but occasionally it would come up with something crazy, and I'd be like, why did that do that? And I wouldn't understand it, but I would say, let me try to breed that one with this one and see where it goes. And then you'd end up with this other thing. And it reminds me of the Cambrian explosion thing. It was almost like I didn't realize what all of my goals would intersect to create. And it wasn't really a culling down. It was actually an exploding out. And then it kind of almost was like the machine learner was pushing back on me and going, this is what you asked for. And I'd be like, that's totally not what I wanted. And it felt to me like jazz in some weird way. And Kate, I think the first time we met and we brainstormed a little bit, you said something, I'm probably going to misquote it, but it was the Zen butcher never sharpens his knife.
Yeah,
what did you
precisely.
Mean by that?
Yeah,
what did you mean by that?
Kind of in this idea of, and I have to apologize because I had arrived at that late. I was low in blood sugar, and there were a lot of people that I was didn't feel like I belonged with, and so I basically went on this deeply
That's the only kind of thing
ramble.
I put together, Kate, is something that everybody feels uncomfortable. Just welcome. But yeah, anyway, elaborate on that.
Yeah, no. So it's kind of my philosophy of how I code, which is not the way that everybody codes, but I have a very visceral response to my code. So there's something called embodied creativity, which is the idea that you think through the object. Like you think with your hands and you think with the object that your hands are in, even if that's sort of metaphorically the IDE in the code that you're working with. And the idea that, so the parable is basically the Zen butcher never has to sharpen his knife because a novice butcher will just kind of hack through the bone. Everything is always a struggle. Everything is kind of working against the system. And you see this a lot in modern AI, where it's we've gotten some really fantastic tools out there, machine learning things, and we just try to, like, the stronger our knife is, the harder we work at just like hacking directly through whatever kind of classical AI problem that we had. Like, oh, well, how are we going to make chatbots? Well, let's just machine learn our way through it until the knife gets dull. And you're doing a lot of work.
Which led
and so,
I think, from Microsoft, if I remember correctly, which became like the most racist bot in the planet within about 24 hours because the internet loves to break things.
And unfortunately, the lesson that they took from a lot of that was, we just need bigger data. If we have more data or have sanitized our data, we can have, the knife will get bigger and sharper, and we can keep sort of chopping through it. And the idea is that the Zen butcher understands how the animal is put together. They understand, like, what is conversation. And they say that conversation is not just but figuring out, if you are the novice conversation bot maker, you might think, oh, well, conversation is just like they say something and then I like go out to some server and figure out what the ultimate thing in response to that is. And the idea is you understand how this kind of conversational animal is put together, and you understand that there are flows and kind of easy choices in some conversations and like different ways that conversations flow together. And if you do this well, you can actually create, when I was at Google prototyping for the Google Assistant, I didn't want to actually like write hard code. And so I made a 1-minute chatbot interaction that the chatbot doesn't actually listen to you at all. But it's a conversational setup so that it's clear that you are, excuse me, hiccups. Even as you're talking to it, it's not listening to you, and yet you can have a conversation. So you can have,
like every man I know.
Yeah. Well, in this case, it was somebody, the bot had made an artwork and wanted your opinion on the artwork.
Perfect.
And it could say, what do you think of my artwork? And it's like, oh, yes, I agree. Like, what do you think the title, or like, my title is this. What do you think? Like, you're right. That's a stupid title is a way better title for this work. I have now labeled it, that's a stupid title. And so it's just kind of this like wonderful like system that understands enough about conversation to kind of slide effortlessly with no technology at all through the problem.
Well, it was almost this notion, you don't push an algorithm to places it doesn't want to go just because, there's some reason it's got a physics to it itself as an algorithm. Danny, what do you see in that world, in that space?
I think like Kit just said something that want to make me talk a bit about curiosity. So one of the things we normally do, brute force in AI, just a lot of data and then random exploration until the system learns enough to figure things out. But there's a whole class of problems that AI systems cannot figure out because the space is just too big and too sparse. So it just never figures it out. And what we found is to look to look nature over the shoulder and think about, scientists. Scientists, they're curious people. What is curiosity? Can we implement curiosity? And it turned out that was very, very easy to implement curiosity. Curiosity is basically, you machine learn, but what you machine learn on is your failure in predicting something. You basically learn to look around, or you learn the computer to look around and say, that thing over there is the thing I'm going to be the worst at predicting, so let me explore that first. And what we see is orders of magnitude more efficient learning by stealing, one of nature's methods, curiosity. And I think that makes AI more efficient. And I think we can steal many other intrinsic values of nature so that we can have empathy, or we can have patience or impatience implemented, etc. I think that AI can be made much more efficient by learning from us people, from learning from nature.
I love that, and I think I was reacting to curiosity and how we explore it. And there's a wonderful Santa Fe Institute author who wrote a book, and I'm not going to get it right. I just was looking behind me to try to find it, but it was about how creativity works in nature. And they did this really deep complexity sort of exploration of it. And it's called something like Nature Finds a Way. And I know that's wrong because that sounds Jeff Goldblum-y, but it's something like that. It's like Life Finds a Way is probably the name of the book. But anyway, fascinating exploration of sort of almost random walk and quantum indeterminacy and things like that, but all the way up to species and how Darwinian sort of the ecological pressure creates the search and the explore mode and how it all works. I remember in this process though of trying to understand sort of creativity or novelty, like maybe GANs, generative adversarial networks and such. I saw Google did this interesting experiment on the research side, where as you were drawing, it was a game for kids. As you were drawing, the AI tried as fast as it could to guess what you were drawing.
Quick Draw.
It was Quick Draw, and it would be like you're drawing. It would be like radio, ham, tuba toothpaste, dog, and it was totally wrong. And the kids would be laughing like crazy. They're like, it's a postcard. why every child in the world could understand it. There was no AI that could. And of course they were doing this to train the AI, but it was cool because the timer was ticking down, and it would be like, it was very fun. And I think the kids were enjoying it, and it taught the kids, I think it taught the parents too, that AI is trying to guess. I think this is around what Danny was saying, was like, try to guess the thing you don't know. But unfortunately, that was like the research team. The product team tried to do something called auto draw. And it was like a year later, and they had trained this system, and I started drawing. Now, Omid, can you pull up the whiteboard for a second? I want to point out that the whole time you've all been talking, I've been drawing. And so I tried to capture in some very bad way the whole conversation. The window of opportunity, all the way to autotelic creativity and things like that. So I draw every episode. So we've got like all the episodes here in some half-baked way. And with auto draw, I am a product designer by training, so I would be sketching something, and I decided to just try to sketch the way I would sketch to come up with an idea. I started drawing something that might be a cool multi-bladed plenum structure for a drone, but it was fun because it was actually going to deliver something. I don't remember. Oh, it was actually going to be to hold pieces of clothing, so that you'd have drones that would actually continually be looking at the eyesight of the audience members and blowing the wind to always make sure the clothing covered your naughty bits. So it was going to be like a drone swarm for maybe Madonna or something like that, or probably Lady Gaga. So I'm drawing it, and AutoDraw immediately tries to put bad Microsoft clip art in. Like, I think you're drawing a plane. It replaced my drawing with a plane that looked horrible from clip art. And all I thought was that was a denial of creativity attack. Like, you literally stabbed me in the face. And I wonder, how do we understand the human-computer interaction element of this? Of how one of them left me really feeling exuberant and kind of excited and playful. And like I was teaching, as Danny said, I was teaching, but we don't learn very well how to teach people or how to coach people, let alone machines. And the other one just felt like brute force. You just broke my concentration, my what did you call it? My embodied creativity.
Yeah, it's an interruption too. It's very
like
clippy.
Yeah.
It's actually one of my pet peeves. It's what you bring up here is the issue of very performant AI systems that does not have a lot of I in them. There's a lot of the dialogue with Siri and Alexa. I mean, like, it's actually not very intelligent. It's very scripted. There's the work GPT-3 that OpenAI did, where they basically trained a neural net on a massive amount of textual data. And there are, I was trying to think about a few other cases. All these, going from Alexa and Siri to GPT-3 and into sketch tools with AI, they're really just incredible efficient, what I call copy and paste systems at internet scale. Yeah, they are good at seeing something you are starting on. You start to say something, you start to write something, you start to draw something, and they have seen something like this before, and they just say, boom, here it is. Yeah, but there's no underlying understanding in the system. And that really gets on my nerves, because what these systems, they do, and I forgot to mention generative networks, GANs, they generate these images. but
Yeah.
there's conceptual understanding beneath. They don't. There's no system understanding what is being said, what is being texted, what is being drawn.
So this is this notion that humans and dogs and octopuses and others all got this thing called a mental model for free through evolution, where from the time we're born, we accrete knowledge on this kind of virtual version of the world. And I've got a mental model of Danny and Peter and Kate, and I kind of start to try to make assertions about it, and I glue them on, and it's either a structure that takes it or it doesn't. And I start to build what cognitive psychologists call a symbotype, which is a relationship map inside my brain between this thing and that thing, and the weight between these relationships. But it's actually a very rich one. And then my actions are the phenotype. How do I show up in the world? Definitely. I mean, I don't know where to go with that, but I feel like that's...
I would like to push back against that a little bit, because I think, especially the closer you are to Silicon Valley and the closer you are to some of these big machine learning projects, it's very, very seductive to look at your example and say, the thing that we needed is more data. If this algorithm were better, it would be better at this. And if you had the smartest algorithm in the world, it still would have been impolite for it to erase your drawing. The place where it failed was not on the smart side.
Yeah.
It was on the dumb side. Somebody had written probably what is a very clear if statement in the code that was the wrong if statement. So a lot of these things can be fixed actually fairly simply. Like it's very nice to have a stronger utility AI, but for things like autocomplete, there's a giant difference that is not a technical difference between me typing the thing and I love my autocomplete on my phone because it gives me 3 options. It's saying, I'm not sure which of these. Yeah. And I can keep typing if it's wrong. And so it's a very polite conversational partner. So we can learn a lot from improv of like, do I acknowledge this suggestion that it's made, or is like, it is a very risky thing for a computer to think that it has so much trust that it can delete something that I've made. That would be a huge trust thing for me, like co-authoring with a human. So if there's a human who is on the other side, Mickey, like trying to paste in a picture, you would be just really, as annoyed at them.
Really pissed off at them. But you just made me think of something, and I want to ask Danny this question. So you said that's a very improv thing, and and I remember really having a wonderful time. I took my entire lab, Maya, and we all went out once a year on a retreat. And we hired a bunch of people from Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center, and they were actually the theater department, because theater department, they require you to take improv as part of the entertainment technology thing. Kate, did you go there? No.
No, but one of the designers of the Spore Creature Creator went there and was a giant improv buff. So yeah, I think all interaction designers should be required to take. It wasn't just their theater department that was required to take improv. The entire department, every engineer was also required to take it.
Every incoming freshman for this master's program, since Randy Pausch created it, the Disney Imagineer, and Shell, oh gosh, is it Drew? Oh, Jesse Shell continues it today. Sorry, my brain is old. But what was interesting was, they came and taught all of us to do this. And I'm teaching engineers and business people and whatever, and psychologists. And this whole idea of yes and of just taking things as a gift and then working with it. Oh, I see you lost your leg, instead of saying what happened. Do we teach that? And is there an improvisational? Do we teach that to AI people? And are there improvisational APIs to AI? In other words, would that be a good thing? It seems like a good thing. Like, could we make Tina Fey bot or something? Like, what would be the best way to train or build an API? Because then I think the AIs would be fun to play with, which is the whole point.
Yeah, I think that the Tina Fey bot gets to another thing where you think that you want the best thing, and what you don't want is Tina Fey. What you want is a good conversational partner. Tina Fey makes a really good product, but it's unclear whether or not you actually have fun doing improv with Tina Fey. You probably would. But this is not like a thing where there's a single best answer. This is a thing where you want to have a good conversational flow. And so you're designing for the conversational flow, not for the Tina Fey. This is where I tend to get a little edgy, just because as soon as people are like, because
you're teaching me something. I think
we'll do the correct one.
I like
you never
it.
want
Danny,
the correct
what
one.
about
You
you?
only want the correct in the moment.
In the moment.
I want to get back to what you talk about the conceptual model, because you are getting very close to my real point here, which is there's a lot of examples of AI that are very impressive. Yeah. We hear constant story about, oh, my children are really, they love Siri, they talk to Siri or they talk to Alexa. Yeah. There's a lot of, I can put in an image and out comes a Picasso drawing of that image. Yeah. But all of these systems have one thing in common, which is they kind of corrupt, they kind of rely on our mental model. Yeah.
It's almost like a mirror. It's just we're seeing ourselves in it.
Yeah, there's no creative process behind style transfer algorithms. Yeah, that can create Picasso pictures. They have nothing to do with Picasso. However, what they do is that they make it look so that you and we think Picasso, and it actually upsets me a bit because it sort of makes people believe that AI is much, much further than it really is. Yeah, it plays some tricks. Yeah, it's the same with the dialogue, scripted dialogues. Oh yeah, I can have a conversation with Alexa, but actually not. She just, the computer just make me think I have a conversation because that computer has no clue what I'm talking about.
Does the same thing apply when we see AIs now that see a musical style and compose a symphony that people actually think is good, or they do writing? Is that an example of just an extreme playing a trick on us where we see patterns, or is that in fact an example of a pretty good system?
But isn't it that we just might enjoy it? I think in some ways we like looking in mirrors. We always have. It's just a weird mirror, but it feels like the danger is that it fools us into thinking something is much closer than it is. Or that all of our either problems are solved, I guess, if we think like tech determinism, or, oh no, I won't have a job anymore if we're sort of a glass half empty model. But I'm sorry, Danny, answer that question too, or Kate. My reaction is,
Peter, you got a point.
Like
some of these technologies and are really great, and we should use them. I feel bad when I sometimes see people sort of actually believing that there's something really behind it.
Well, of course, this goes back to Eliza, the original fake AI that was written to prove it was a bad idea, and so the secretary fell in love with it, thinking it was a good idea.
I love that example.
Yeah,
because that's apocryphal, and it's always told as though it's one of the undergrads or one of the secretaries. It's always somebody who's not one of the programmers. And it's always, oh yes, they were so credulous. And I think this is really fascinating because these are theater pieces. And if I go to see Peter Pan and they say, oh, Tinkerbell's dead, clap for her. And I start clapping for her, it's not because I don't know what theater is or that I don't know what it is for a fairy to die. I'm clapping because I'm happy to be part of the scene. Like if you're playing a video game, you believe that you're in the screen in the same way that you believe in theater. But I think I agree with Danny's point is this gets us into a lot of trouble because currently the blend between a fun theater AI and an AI that's about to decide whether or not somebody gets probation is very blurry. And so there's especially I have to talk down, I do a lot of this AI outreach stuff, and I have basically a side business in talking down journalists from having Terminator pictures in their articles. Because I have to talk them through okay, they've said this thing, they've presented this really cool theater piece of, yes, this, look at our bot, it makes Shakespeare. As long as you don't listen to it or actually try to read what it's saying, it's got Shakespearean pixels all over it. And if you squint really hard and kind of blur your eyes, it looks almost like Shakespearean stuff, unless you want to plot
it's like
a character.
A patina of Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's a blurry Shakespeare substitute. It's Splenda Shakespeare. It definitely tastes almost like Shakespeare if you don't have working taste buds.
So by the way, I'm making that as a product right now.
Yeah. So without our mental model, without our preconception, there's no Shakespeare there. Yeah. And that's what sort of bothers me with a lot of examples. Academics are doing it. You see from companies. They sort of allude to this being much, much further than it really is. Yeah. And maybe real deals get then sort of really not talked about, we can say
So all of these say that these are examples of computers playing into genres, and since we understand a genre, we either cut its slack or play the game with it.
Mhm.
So would it be original if it created a new genre that didn't match a pattern, or is the very fact that it was a genre? How would we jump the shark and declare it original?
Yeah,
I don't
imagine
think
that
there.
AI just really built a conceptual model, that it does define a new art form, a new art style, and it actually explores that in an intelligent manner. Yeah, and then
Well,
we look at it and we start understanding that where it comes from. I don't know if that's possible, if we want it, but that would be a very different thing. Yeah, but just being a copy paste, I don't know. That's not.
Yeah,
that's computers, not intelligence.
You reminded me of I listened to this great podcast that's Voices from DARPA, and it has some of the program managers working on really hard problems, and DARPA is a good place to look for where the really hard problems are. And they were talking about they try to write the problem framing in like a sentence. Like, could an average company put more than 1 trillion transistors on a chip? And that led to the VLSI initiative that led to NVIDIA and Mac and Apple's having their own chips instead of just Intel. Well, this one was, could an AI system win a Nobel Prize for a scientific discovery of a new theory of the universe? Right? Because that assumes like Newton making these leaps of things. And also it assumes knowing what not to trust about their own assumptions. That's kind of hard. And all the things like it pulls in Feynman, it pulls in Newton, but this idea that would be an epic goal, because that would show that it was able to somehow assemble a theoretical model and go past it in a predictable way that was powerful. I feel like we're getting late into the night, and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to go have the rest of their evening. Peter, do you have any last things, or Kate or Danny?
So Danny, one place I'd love to wrap up was a place that we began, which was at this kind of interface between cities, digital twins, and the kind of the artificial or the gaming world. What do you see as kind of so much of our national purpose now moves towards simulating economies, coming in with better ways of cities? What do you see on the horizon there, both from clients that are using that and from tools that enable researchers or perhaps ultimately all of us to be involved in that activity, that game?
Yeah, I mean, like we engaged in this. There are many companies engaged in creating platforms, tool sets, technology stacks that can democratize simulation, that can use AIs to create interesting scenarios and analyze those scenarios at massive scale. That really allows us to explore buildings before we build them, explore cities before we plan them, test products before they're ever built. I think it's going to lead to a much more sustainable and much more efficient world when it comes to producing, to manufacturing, to structuring and building things.
I had the experience many years ago when he was a member of Congress. Al Gore asked me to teach a class to members of Congress in computing. And I said to him, why do you care about bits and bauds and bytes? He goes, we don't. But people walk in and they go, look, Mr. Congressman, here's a model that says the ozone hole's disappearing. And we want to know where that comes from. And to make a long story short, when we exposed members of Congress to dynamic models, and we gave them the Social Security system, and what they basically came away with is, this is complex, it's difficult, and we're really glad that we get elected only every 2 years because long-term thinking is difficult. And I'm wondering if, as we simulate things, when I think of building simulations, I think of making the decisions to trade off about materials, sunlight and heat and strength, and all right. But do we get further where we can start helping people start thinking through what are better ways of running economies, or even solving the problem we talked about before, the behavioral economics front, which is we always buy insurance when it's too late. In other words, how do we use these to start changing our behavior and anticipating and building a smarter world with longer term thinking?
Yeah, I think that that is a very important aspect. I actually saw an example the other day where some researchers are actually using generative techniques to generate extreme weather conditions. That is like weather conditions we can hardly imagine.
Yeah.
And then they run them through the existing weather models we have to see if how they're going to deal with this extreme weather. And that's really about long-term thinking.
Yeah.
It actually brings me, I have an answer for the superpowers. Yeah. I thought about it.
Oh, okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So the superpowers I want to wake up with tomorrow morning is to not only halt, but reverse climate change, because that is by far the only important thing right now. It's really the one that puts the whole humanity and everything else on Earth at real risk. Yeah. So that would be a superpower. If I only get one of them, that would be one.
That was a pretty good pick. Okay, Kate, any last words?
Gosh, any last words? I would say, yeah, I'm such an aficionado of human expression that there are lots of AI that should come up with the right answer, or at least a right-ish answer. Like, it's got to support a car, it's got to direct a car correctly, it's got to fit so many objects into a package, and yet for all of these, whenever I see the computer can generate Shakespeare or the computer can generate poetry, I think about these Twitter bots that people have made. And again, these are about as minimal viable AI as you could possibly get without just using a deck of cards. And people find emotionally resonant things that they've created. And the problem is not that it had a great model of what people are. It had a great model of, what dramatic tension is, or what irony is, or what rhythm is. But we saw something. The reason that they're on Twitter is because there's people on Twitter. And so the reason that bots are better on Twitter than they would be otherwise is because they now have a giant audience, and the audience is finding the good bits. It's the humans that are finding the human expressive pieces. The bots have gotten no smarter, but the humans can now curate things, and the humans can now sort of mine emotional metal out of the raw ore of bots. So
Where
yeah,
would you
that's,
send us
and
off
speaking of niches, like just the computer makes a bunch of stuff, and then the humans find and retweet the things that say like
They
it
fill
me,
in and
like this is me.
Yeah, I like that.
Where would you send us off to go have some fun and explore these forms of more maker AI humor and fun? Where should we go play in a sandbox to learn?
You can just search for tracery tutorial or cheapbots done quick tutorial. Sorry, my internet is ghastly right now.
Say that again.
I think, well, we could put up galaxykate.com probably.
Yeah.
And Omid, can you put up her clearinghouse site of all of her stuff? I think that would be good. Yeah, Kate, you're breaking up. And then Danny, how would people get started learning about Unity or playing with it if they've just only seen it as games, but if they actually wanted to try something or experiment with it?
I mean, like, you can go and download it. We have all our education, all our training is for free. And on the AI side, we actually created a open source framework. It's on GitHub called ML Agents that essentially allows anyone within hours to start training reinforcement learning agents. And it was something that when I joined Unity, I noticed that it would take researchers 3-4 months to sort of set up the environments, and then they can do the research for a couple of months, and then that's it. And I basically set out to the team. I said, let's make this not 4 months, but 4 hours. And we're down there. It has now become the most popular framework for exploring reinforcement learning.
Oh, excellent.
So yeah, I want to see as many people being aware of the capabilities of this technology. I think that makes for a more informed society and better decision making around where to use AI and where not to use it.
Perfect. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. Peter?
Hey, thank you very much. We're going to continue on this theme. In fact, next week we have Timoni from Unity, and we have the head of digital twinning from the United Kingdom. So we're going to dig deeper into this theme. And in the interim, between these two chats, we're going to go deeper on the world of understanding new and emerging media. Friday's guest will be Andrew McLuhan. He's Marshall McLuhan's grandson, and we're going to dig into some of Marshall McLuhan's original writings and unpublished notes to try to unpack these very rapid changes we're making in these medium of gaming, of AI, and kind of what the social media is doing to ourselves. So that's
now. Why are you doing Andrew McLuhan on this Friday? What's your motivation? Peter?
Oh yes, well that's a very good point. This Friday, it turns out that there's a tradition that Marshall McLuhan started in 1976. There was a presidential debate between Carter and Ford, and Marshall McLuhan came on the Today Show the next day and critiqued it. And by the way, this was a debate. There's an antecedent here. You may realize that this debate, the big conversation is they may be cutting mics off. They may be cutting mics off, and if you cut off Donald Trump's microphone, is he still Donald Trump? Well, it turns out that in 1976, the sound went out for about 25 minutes. And McLuhan came on and said this was clearly the revenge of the medium over the message because no one was saying anything, so the medium decided to cut it out. So we thought we would bring Andrew on the day after the debate, and Andrew explained to me, because he's Canadian, he doesn't understand much about U.S. politics. And I said, that is so much better, because if you did, you'd be too close to it. We want to know what's really going on, how they're using the medium, who is medium hot, who is medium cold, and how this is being used.
So we're putting him on the spot to be sort of Marshall McLuhan's ghost for the medium is the massage.
We're gonna get into this, and we'll have some other guests who will help us also understand. You know, when McLuhan wrote Understanding Media, his last chapter was on automation. So it was kind of anticipating the coming of computing. But even though he didn't get too far into computing, he got deeply into kind of what we would think of as cyberspace or nonlinear thinking. He talked about it as acoustic space. But McLuhan talked about the fact that with the invention of printing, we went from kind of an oral tradition that was very instantaneous and perhaps to use the word entanglement today, but then printing came in with the Enlightenment, with kind of very orderly thinking, linear thinking, and McLuhan said with the coming of TV, that all went away. Well, it's certainly gone away even more, so it becomes a great framework in which to look at these things. I think sometimes that way of thinking is underappreciated, so we're going to have some fun with that, and also look at kind of, we're now hitting this very accelerating limit function of what happens when we're all virtual all the time. So we'll dig into that, I think, on Friday.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you for having us.
Always a pleasure.
Everybody, it is now 5:52 Pacific Quorum Time. Have a wonderful day.
Let's get close, but not so